Welcome back to History with Mr. E. Now, yesterday you guys learned about the entirety of World War I, and that was a big day. We learned about the beginnings of the Communist Party and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But today we're going to talk at length about the rise of communism in Russia. The war's over in Europe, but things in Russia are a mess. There were Slavs in Eastern Europe at Kiev. Kiev is a city in Ukraine. That's an independent republic. It's, I think, south of the Russian Republic. Slavs in the Eastern Europe settled at Kiev. Those were the first Russian people. They were invaded by a German tribe or a Viking tribe called the Rus, and the land became known as Russia, or the land of the Rus, or Kiev on Rus. In 988, a missionary named Vladimir the Saint brought Christianity to Russia. But by 1240, Russia fell to the invading Mongolian horde. The Mongols, which had conquered most of China, also came and conquered Russia and held Russia for 250 years. The city of Moscow rose to power, and it's still the capital, I think. St. Petersburg might be the capital now, but I think Moscow is the capital of Russia. The Mongols conquered Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Orthodox Church was adopted as the major religion in Russia. The Eastern Orthodox Church, that's not the Holy Roman Church, or the Catholic Church, but the offshoot of the Catholic Church from the Eastern Roman Empire, the Orthodox Church. Ivan III, in 1480, a man named Ivan III, drove the Mongols out of Russia and retook Russia and made himself the first true national leader of Russia. His son or heir, Ivan IV, took on the title of Tsar, which is a derivation of what word, Riley? C-Z-A-R, Tsar, is a derivation of the word Caesar. You are correct, Caesar. Good job, Riley. And Ivan IV basically called himself the Emperor, or the Caesar of Russia. We know him as Ivan the Terrible, but in Russia he was known as Ivan Grozny. Grozny means less like the terrible as more like the awesome, or unbearably tough, or really, really frightening and strong and powerful. We just call him Ivan the Terrible because that's a pretty easy word to describe all the other stuff we talked about. He was a psycho. He's the one that enslaved the peasants of Russia and made them serfs. You know, serfdom is feudalism. He tied the peasants of Russia to the land. They were little more than slaves for hundreds of years. Remember, Ivan IV was the Tsar from 1533 to 1584. He made Orthodox the official church of Russia, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And he started a dynasty in Russia, the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty. And they stayed as the rulers of Russia, the Romanovs, or offshoots of their family, or people that claim to be Romanovs, for 300 years until the Russian Revolution in 1917. And over these 300 years, the czars grew stronger and stronger, and the plight of the serfs got worse and worse. One of the greatest emperors or czar of Russia was Peter the Great. He tried to make Russia more like a European nation instead of a wild, feudal kingdom. He tried to westernize or Europeanize Russia. He was a giant man, 7 feet tall, huge personality, and just sounded super Russian. But he was crazy enough to think that he could westernize Russia. He was crazy enough to think that he could put on a disguise and travel all over Europe in disguise to learn about how Europe and how Europeans lived and how to modernize Russia. Nobody really believed the disguise. Everybody kind of knew it was Peter the Great, but nobody really wanted to mess with the dude. He was 7 feet tall and traveled with a massive entourage. He fought wars against Sweden and took land from Sweden and built himself a major port city. He knew that Russia needed a port if they were going to thrive in a European trade community. So he built a major port city and named it after himself, and named himself a saint too. He named the city St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg. And he called it the window to the West. And he helped Russia join the modern age and become Europeanized. The next great leader of Russia was Catherine the Great. And I could tell stories about her for days, but most of them are pretty harsh and not appropriate for young people. She was a crazy person. She was an Austro-Hungarian princess that was married into the Russian Romanov dynasty. She married Peter III in 1762. And then she deposed him in a coup and took the throne from him. She reformed the feudal system that was prevalent in Russia, but she never got rid of it. She expanded Russian borders all the way to the Black Sea, which means nothing unless you guys look at a map. Thank you. And she conquered parts of Poland and other parts of Europe. She was probably the greatest ruler that Russia ever really had. I mean, they had famous rulers like Peter the Great, who did a lot of good things, but Catherine the Great was the super queen, kind of like Victoria of England. But they conquered Ukraine and part of Poland. Another great Tsar of Russia was Nicholas I. He is the one who built the bureaucracy, the government offices of Russia. And he also set up, very sadly, the secret police of Russia. And he used those secret police to control the press, the universities, and many other aspects of Russian life. The Russian people fought hard to relieve themselves of oppression, only to be more oppressed. Nicholas I was a massive force for government power in Russia. Alexander II was the Tsar Liberator. He's known as the Tsar Liberator, and he is the Tsar that freed the serfs. The government bought land from the rich and gave it to groups of the serfs and formed big communal farms, but they were forced to pay the government for those lands. So the Tsar owned their land, they had to work it, and they were basically no worse or just as bad off as the serfs ever were. He expanded Russia's borders, Alexander II, into Eastern Europe and into Asia, but was not well loved, even though he freed the serfs. He was assassinated in 1881. Tsar Alexander III, our book barely mentions him, but he was known for massacring Jews and killing Jews. The Russians hate Jewish people almost as much as the Nazis did. Nicholas II was the final Tsar of Russia. Now, we haven't talked about every Tsar or every ruler of Russia during the Romanov dynasty, because that could take us days. I took 2 Russian history courses in college. Two of them. And we just barely scraped the surface of Russian history. It's a completely different type of pseudo-European history than the history that we've learned about in Europe. It's totally different than Asian history. It's just their own thing. Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia. He was the Tsar that was deposed in the Russian Revolution and eventually put to death. During his reign as Tsar, communism grew and rose up in Russia. Communism was a theory written by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was an atheist thinker. Atheist, of course, you guys know what that means. He doesn't believe in God. An atheist thinker and philosopher. He wanted to eliminate religion, and he blamed all the sad woes in the class struggle in Russia between the poor and the rich. He blamed private property, the owning of private property, as the source of the class struggle. Is that true? No. I mean, we have capitalism in America, and that, and people have been healthy, wealthy, and wise for many, many years. But he blamed the owning of private property as the source of the class struggle in Russia. He was very, very opposed to capitalism. He believed that the rich and the middle class would own everything until the poor people rose up and took it from them. Where did this happen before? You're right, it happened in the French Revolution. And was that a good thing? No. Was it good what the French nobility was doing to the poor in France? No. But when you rise up with an atheist revolution and only do it for greedy reasons that you haven't earned your freedom, and you're not even fighting so much for freedom as to take things off of rich people, then that is the wrong reason to fight a revolution. Marx opposed capitalism. He wanted the poor to rise up and form a socialist state. Socialism is an economic system. Now you're going to need to hear this. Socialism is an economic system based on government ownership and control of all business and industry. No more private business, no more private industry. It's all government control of business and industry. That's socialism. Socialism. He believed and spoke and wrote that the poor would have to rise up in a bloody revolution and become a dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat was the name of the poor people. That was what he called the poor people. He said that then, and only then, if they rose up against the rich and took the rich down, the state would fall away and society would become a stateless, classless, perfect condition beyond socialism, and he called that communism. He called religion the opiate of the people. And he and a friend, Friedrich Engels, Engels, Karl Marx, Marx, and Friedrich Engels, wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, and it had these 8 points in it. The book came out in 1848, by the way. Number 1 was abolish private property. Everything would be owned by the state and by the collective of the people. Abolish private property, number 1. Number 2, redistribute wealth through heavy progressive income taxes. Redistribute wealth through heavy progressive income taxes. That means take all the money from rich people. Redistribute wealth through heavy progressive income taxes. Number 3, centralize a federal bank. Make the government the banker and put them in control of all the money. Number 4, the government would have to take control of communication and transportation. Number 4, the government would take control of communication and transportation. Number 5, the government would own the means of production and all natural resources. So the government would own all natural resources. Coal, water, wood, all that stuff, land, and then they would own all means of production, all factories, all plants that would process things. They would own all the farm equipment, everything. Government owns means of production and all natural resources. Number 6, abolition of unemployment through social welfare programs. Everybody would be put to work. Sounds like slavery to me, doesn't it? Everybody would be put to work. Number 7, redistribute the population. That meant all the people that lived in cities, all the people that lived on farms would be collected up and redistributed. And anybody that they felt needed a job would be put into different jobs. They made skilled laborers into farmers. They made professors into factory workers. They moved around. They wanted to move around everybody so that everybody could do or was given a job to do, and nobody was able to really become the greatest at their job or gain wealth from their job. And finally, number 8, mandatory state-sponsored and state-supported education. That meant the state controlled education and controlled the minds of the youth. The problem was this. Friedrich Engels was a capitalist. He owned a factory. Why did he write this Communist Manifesto? I mean, it's a short book. I guess he thought of it as a academic exercise. But Karl Marx never worked a day in his life. He lived in poverty in London, not even Russia, because he'd been kicked out of Russia, with his wife and 6 kids, 3 of which died, and 2 more of which committed suicide. Their lives were horrible. He was a leech, a moocher. He believed in communism so much that he refused to work. He just thought he'd get everything he should from the government. Then Karl Marx wrote another book to try to explain the theoretical foundations for communist ideology, where the theory of communism came from. He wrote another book called Das Kapital, D-A-S-K-A-P-I-T-A-L, D-A-S-K-A-P-I-T-A-L, the theoretical foundations of communist ideology. What a mess. People got a hold of this communist ideology and ran with it. Tsar Nicholas II was hated by most intelligent Russians. Russia was stuck in the Middle Ages. The poor got poorer, and even though the serfs weren't called serfs anymore, they were still peasants who had to work the land. Nicholas fought a war against Japan and lost, a bad mess of a war, and even had to crush a revolt because of the Russo-Japanese War, that war with Japan, the Russo, R-U-S-S-O, Japanese War. There was a revolt, And the Tsar had to crush that revolt of the poor, the workers. But he was forced to create parliament, which they called the Duma, and elect a legislature with limited powers to appease the revolution from happening again. And then the real problems happened. World War I was badly mishandled by the Tsar, and 1 million Russians died by 1917. Millions more lost all their food and wealth due to the fact that all the food and money was going to the war effort, and millions of people were facing starvation. The people rose up. In February of 1917, there were food riots in St. Petersburg, and the soldiers joined the rebellion. They went against their government, their Tsar, and joined the rebellion. The Duma created a Western-style government. The Tsar was taken out of power, asked to resign, and they moved toward democracy and made the right steps toward democracy, but unfortunately World War I was destroying the country. The new government fell apart. They needed to get out of that war. And Lenin, who had been kicked out of the country, was smuggled back into the country by the Germans, who wanted a revolution. They wanted Russia to fall apart. And Lenin rose to power. V.I. Lenin rose to power through anti-war propaganda. He preached against the war and preached that getting out of the war would save Russia. And he created himself a militia that he called the Bolsheviks. 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 It was his own private army, a secret military. He also called them the Red Guards. And they took out the provisional government on November 6th, 1917, and formed the communist state of Russia. Lenin ruled Russia till his death in 1924. He immediately ended Russian involvement in World War I and formed a totalitarian government. Does that sound communist to you guys? No. It was a thinly veiled totalitarian government. He was the ultimate leader of the country, and through revolutionary terror, through his secret police named the Cheka, Cheka, he forced the people of Russia to support communism, or three things would happen to you. You would be arrested, you would be tortured, you would be killed. You didn't get a chance at a trial. You just knew that if you went against the Red Guard, you would die. That happened in 1917, and by 1920, Russia was full of concentration camps, slave labor camps, and cost the lives of 50,000 Russians. This wasn't a war. This was the government murdering its own people, because communists don't have any respect for human life. Socialists don't have any respect for human life. It is the worship of government control. It is an atheistic, God-hating society. It is the government trying to be in complete control of humans' lives. We cannot allow socialism to become part of our country. The Russians fought a civil war from 1918 to 1921. The democratic Russians, called the White Russians, and the Red Russians, the communists. But the White Russians fell to the Red Russians. Immediately after the war, Nicholas II and his entire family were murdered, shot to death, burned, chucked into a hole, and buried. The government seized all land from all landowners. They nationalized all the banks and industries. They forced all the workers to join the Communist Party. They controlled the trade unions, wouldn't allow people to go on strike. They rationed all the food and consumer goods. There was no private trade. Everything was controlled by the government. They confiscated all the lands that belonged to the church and pretty much put a near end to the Russian Orthodox Church. And human life to the state, the communist government, had no value. They didn't care who died as long as the government remained in power. They forced communist-controlled education, which taught communist principles that we've talked about in class today. They were atheist, godless, God-hating. They taught that capitalism and religion were completely evil. They destroyed the typical traditional father, mother, son, daughter, family unit. Children were taken from their home, put in schools, forced into labor, indoctrinated with communist propaganda, and life in communism was all about the communist state. The communists even created an international terrorist organization in 1919 called the Third International. This was created and organized by their leader, Lenin, to spread communist revolution all around the world. Terrorists infiltrated American business and factories and labor unions, and all through China, all through Africa, all through Europe. This Third International basically waged a secret terrorist war against capitalism. They had new economic policy because their economy was failing after a few years of communism. You couldn't have a professor learn to be a farmer. You couldn't have a woodcutter learn to work on a railroad. They should have allowed people to do their jobs, and maybe the country could have succeeded, right? Because the economy was failing, Lenin began to back off from some of his policies and allowed private business into Russia once again to try to boost the economy. In 1922, the Russians formed the United Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, which lasted almost until 1990. They wanted to bring all Russian nationalists under communist regime, all non-Russian nationalists, and not Russian, but non-Russian nationalists into communism. They took over 15 republics. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They took over 15 formerly free nations and controlled them, and 1/7 of the earth, 300 million people, were under the rule of the communist government. Their headquarters in Moscow is called the Kremlin, Kremlin. And in 1924, Lenin died and left a massive power vacuum. A massive power vacuum. Two rivals emerged in this power vacuum. Two rivals emerged for control of Russia. A man named Leon Trotsky, who should have been the successor to Lenin, and a political maneuvering evil person named Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, who took out Trotsky, who had taken over for Lenin after Lenin died. And Trotsky was forced to flee to Mexico and was murdered in 1940 by a Soviet assassin. Joseph Stalin was brutal, vile, disgusting, evil dictator, megalomaniac, power-hungry, and extremely paranoid. He could tolerate no opposition to communism, to his rule in Russia. He murdered at least 5 million of his people in different purges. His economic policy was called the 5-year plan. He took all agriculture and made it collectivized under the state. Agriculture is farming. Collectivized all agriculture. And 10 million, not 5 million, 10 million peasants died under Stalin, most from starvation. 10 million peasants died under Stalin. 7 million had died under Lenin. So all of a sudden, the people of Russia are suffering in ways they never thought they could suffer. Starvation and death. Just over and over under communist rule. Yes, 1 million people died in World War I, but 17 million people died under Lenin and Stalin. Stalin was so paranoid that he would purge his government every few years because he thought they were going to rise up against him and kill all who opposed him. Even his Communist Party, he murdered everyone that he thought opposed him, and he enslaved his country. Stalin was a truly, truly evil man. And that is all for today's history with Mr. E.